Marianne is the embodiment of the French République. Marianne represents the permanent values that found her citizens' attachment to the Republic: liberty, equality, fraternité. The earliest representation of a woman wearing a Phrygian cap, an allegorical figure of liberty and the République, made their appearance at the time of the French Revolution. The origins of the name Marianne are uncertain. Marianne was a very common first name in the 18th century, and she thus came to represent the people. The counter-revolutionaries used the name derisively when referring to the République. So, Tom, that was the website of the Élysée Palace talking about the great symbol of the French Republic, Marianne. So this is a symbol that emerges at the point that we've just got to in the great narrative of the French Revolution, the summer and autumn of 1792. We heard last time about the terrible September Massacres that took place as the Prussians were advancing on Paris. And it's, of course, at this point that people are singing the Marseillaise, the marching song of the Army of the Rhine that has swept through the capital. But it's also at this point that people alight upon a new symbol of France, which is this figure of Marianne.
Marianne, who is this woman wearing the Phrygian cap, the Liberty cap, long flowing hair, will become the emblem of France itself. And I think it's really striking that two of the kind of emblematic embodiments of modern France, so the Marseillaise, its national anthem, and the figure of Marianne, the embodiment of France herself, emerge in precisely these months, the summer going into the autumn of 1792. And I guess the previous episode that we did where we looked at the September Massacres, I mean, it didn't really portray the revolution in a great light, did it? I mean, if we're absolutely honest.
Not the best light, no.
But I think this kind of reminds us that even while people are being dragged out of prisons and hacked to death, there is also an absolutely invigorating and inspiring sense of optimism and hope that is inspiring terrible deeds, yes, but also, it's rallying people to the barricades and it's giving people dreams of a better future.
Yes.
A future in which all of the people of France will have a stake. So you mentioned at the end of the last episode, you left us with this absolute cliffhanger that the Prussians are advancing on Paris, but you also talked about how there is this new political settlement, there's this national convention, and elections are being held to it. And you said, if the Prussians break into Paris, then maybe the convention will never even meet. A spoiler alert, the Prussians don't end up advancing on Paris for reasons that we'll discuss in the next episode. And that the National Convention does meet, and it meets on the 20th of September. And the deputies who are going there, they're all going to the Tuileries, where the royal family had previously been based until the massacre of their guards and their removal to what ultimately is their prison. So this is now at the center of the convention, which is an expression of, in a way, popular sovereignty. What is striking about this, and it's not just in the French context, but in the context of the whole of global history, is that this is a near universal suffrage for men. There are no distinctions of class. There are no distinctions of property. People may remember back in the mists of time that we talked about originally, there was this idea of active and passive citizens, weren't there? That active citizens, you had to have certain property qualifications. You couldn't have certain professions. Yeah. All that has gone. All males basically over the age of 21 now have the vote. And I think this is a kind of noble and inspiring moment in history. No matter what your views on the revolution might be, Dominic, would you disagree with that or not? I mean, maybe don't you think?
I would. I don't find it inspiring at all. Well, I don't think everybody should have the vote. So
okay,
that's the difference between me and the French revolutionaries.
So who do you think should not have the vote?
I probably wouldn't give it to anybody, but I definitely raised the age thing. I think probably 30,
35, 40.
And also property. I think you need to be a property. You need to own property, don't you?
Fine. Okay. The voice of John Bull.
Otherwise, you've got no stake in the system.
I think you know that you are just teasing. I'm sure you are a Democrat.
Tom, that has thrown you so much. You don't know. I can't believe
I don't really know.
I don't really know how to reply to that.
Come on. This is universal suffrage. This is democracy in action. It's the closest to the modern ideal of democracy that we have. It's an ideal that Britain now cleaves to. So in that sense, you could say that Britain is inspired by this example as well. Yeah. And Marianne kind of becomes the symbol of it. And the reason for that is the motion that is brought before the deputies the day after they meet on the 20th September, on the 21st of September, when they essentially vote to abolish monarchy. Royalty shall be abolished in France is the motion. And this is where the woman who comes to be called Marianne is introduced. Because again, to quote from the Élysée Palace, Marianne is the embodiment of the French Republic. And so how does it come about? How does this woman appear? How does she come to be called Marianne? It's actually not until the middle of the 19th century that she's kind of universally called Marianne.
But the Élysée Palace thing that I read at the beginning is wrong.
Oh, yeah.
Am I not right in thinking that we know better than the Élysée Palace?
Go on.
So the Élysée Palace said, who knows where the name comes from? We know precisely where the name comes from. The name comes from this poem that is written in, I think, October 1792?
To mark the founding of the Republic.
And interestingly, the poem is not in French. I mean, that's what makes it so fascinating.
Yeah, so it's by a guy called Guillaume Lavabre, who is writing in Languedoc, and he writes this poem called La Guérison de Marianne, the healing of Marianne in French. And in that poem, Marianne is clearly an embodiment of the new republic that's been proclaimed. And this is the first equation of the republic with a woman called Marianne. But unlike the Marseillaise, it doesn't really spread because it's not as accessible. And it takes a long, long time for that equation to kind of spread. As I said, it's not really until the 19th century.
Yeah.
And so originally, the figure of France as a woman, she's not called Marianne. She is very clearly liberty, and specifically Republican liberty.
Right.
And the emergence of an image of France as a woman who embodies liberty. As we said, this is emerging at the same time as the Marseillaise is being enshrined as the national anthem. And so it's expressive of all the convulsions, all the excitements, all the kind of incredible process of change that these months in 1792 that we've been covering in the previous series and in this series are generating. And she appears very precisely in the wake of the abolition of the monarchy, when the royal seal, great golden seal of Louis XVI, is melted down and reconfigured. And on the new seal of the Republic, this is where Liberty, who will become Marianne, first appears.
So the figure of liberty, we've talked so much about the influence of the Romans in particular on the French revolutionists. So this is a very obviously classical figure, basically a goddess holding the fasces with an axe and a liberty cap. That's right, isn't it? So is there a bit of Athena about this figure, maybe?
Well, she's liberty. She's a classical abstraction given female form. And as with so much about the French Revolution, it actually has its roots in the Ancien Régime. So the painters, illustrators had been showing liberty as this kind of goddess in the years before the revolution breaks out. So there was a particularly famous illustration in a book about Henry IV, who was the great hero of France before the revolution. He was seen as the people's king. And this illustration shows him being carried up to heaven by liberty, by this goddess. This is kind of allegorical illustrations and paintings that really have very little cut through, but it's kind of there on the margins. And actually, I think you could say that the very value of liberty is that she is a kind of a bit of an empty cipher. She's a kind of an abstraction onto which you can project things. So Lynn Hunt, the great scholar of the kind of the culture of the French Revolution, particular interest in the role of women in the revolution, she wrote about the figure of liberty, that she represented the virtues so desired by the new order, the transcendence of localism, superstition, and particularity in the name of a more disciplined and universalistic worship. Liberty was an abstract quality based on reason. She belonged to no group, to no particular place, which is another way of saying that the whole point of liberty is that she's quite boring. She doesn't bring any baggage. And it's important because, of course, the marketing of liberty is also a marketing of the Republic, and she's being stamped on the seal at the point where people don't really know what the Republic is about. What's it going to be? It doesn't have any of the attributes that a 1,000-year-old monarchy has. It doesn't bring the inheritance of symbols that France, particularly royal France, has been absolutely saturated in. And instead, she's kind of almost Robespierre. She's kind of chilly, poised, uptight, virtuous. And of course, there are the two obvious contrasts here. So even though she will come to be called Marianne, she's not Christian. She's not the Virgin. She is a virgin who is not Christian. And I think that's, as we will see in probably our next series, what you do with Notre Dame, Our Lady, the Virgin, will be a pointed issue in due course for the revolution. So Liberty, Marianne, is not the Virgin Mary. But of course, also, she's not an earthly queen. And more precisely, she is not Marie Antoinette. She is not an aristocratic woman. And generally, women who are, paintings, images, they're from the aristocracy. The whole point of Liberty is she is not.
Right. She's classless, I suppose, isn't she? I mean, she's not defined by any... And because she's antique, she doesn't represent any particular group in contemporary France. She's universal.
Exactly. And as you said, there are kind of obviously echoes of Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom. So in due course, she comes to be shown wearing a helmet. She's shown kind of trampling down various monsters representing counter-revolution and monarchy or whatever. And so pretty much within a year of her first appearance on the Great Seal of France, she's starting to become a bit more proactive. And of course, the classic expression of this isn't in this French Revolution, but in a later one, in Delacroix's great painting of Liberty leading the people. I'm sure people will have seen it. Liberty standing there in her Liberty cap, urging the revolutionaries on. And I think you get a kind of presentiment of that in the First Revolution as well. But Dominic, I think there's a kind of interesting question about all this, that France, Liberty, the Republic, the Revolution are all being imaged by this figure of a beautiful, slightly chilly woman. But what does it mean? I mean, does it have any resonance at all for the actual women who were living through the revolution?
So we started the entire cycle of French Revolution series with a woman, with Marie Antoinette, and the extraordinary misogyny of the attacks on her. And then, although virility, masculine friendship, martial virtue and all of that, these masculine ideas have mattered enormously to the ethos of the French Revolution. There have been moments, haven't there, when women have taken center stage. So I think you did an episode about the women's march on Versailles, when the market women go and bring back the king and Marie Antoinette. And the symbolism of it being the market women, I think, is really important there, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then, of course, you've got women who are prominent in the sans-culottes, who are storming the Tuileries, who are shouting slogans in the streets. So it's not just a man's revolution by any means.
Absolutely. So I think we talked before in the previous series about how the idea of the sans-culotte, the man who is wearing trousers rather than the breeches, that is kind of the traditional markers of wealth and status, how important dress is. And there are female sans-culottes. They're not wearing trousers, but they're wearing kind of coarse woolen skirts, and they're wearing the wooden clogs that are the markers of a sans-culotte, and they wear the carmagnole, this kind of jacket that has ultimately come from kind of revolutionaries in Italy. And because of the role that they played in bringing the king and queen from Versailles to Paris back in 1789, and as you said, because of the role that they also play in helping the patriot heroes who stormed the Tuileries in the summer of 1792, they are enshrined as a group as kind of mothers of the nation. But I think there is a crucial difference between the way that women are portrayed in revolutionary propaganda and the way that men are, because we've talked about revolutionary figures whose names continue to reverberate down. So everyone has heard of Robespierre or Marat or Desmoulins. These are individuals who kind of stand tall in the pages of history. But women, by and large, don't. And that is a trend that goes back to the revolution itself. So we talked about Marat, who, of course, in due course will have a meeting with a woman who's not very keen on him in his bath. But before that, he was very proud of himself as a feminist. He marketed himself not just as the friend of the people, but specifically as the friend of women. But when he writes about women, he never names individuals. It's always about the totality of women.
Yeah.
They are a kind of a mass of humanity who are inspired by a kind of animating energy and an animating emotional power. They're spontaneous. This is key to how the March on Versailles is portrayed. They are not individuals, and in that way they are kept safe. They're not intruding on the kind of masculine sphere. And this carries on even when they're not kind of marching on Versailles or attacking palaces or whatever, because women in Paris in particular, which is the cockpit of revolutionary activity, they are very, very keen spectators. So the sense of particularly women from the markets, people, fishwives, as political junkies is very, very strong. They're generally not allowed to contribute to the public debate itself, but they are given access to the galleries, where spectators gather. They take up public seats at the convention when it meets. And by and large, male revolutionaries are very appreciative of this. So there's one when it turns out that women are not being allowed in to watch a political session because too many people have gathered there. And one of the Jacobin deputies kind of posing like a Roman. It's exactly the kind of thing that you could imagine someone in the early pages of Livy or Plutarch saying. He orders that more benches be brought in so that they can sit down. These are mothers of families, he tells the other delegates. They are worthy of ancient Rome. And it may be because Robespierre in particular is so good at playing the Roman that he is a particular favourite of these women who come to cheer and support the various Jacobin deputies. And the fact that Robespierre, despite his kind of slight image of chilly asexuality, is an absolute heartthrob. I mean, he has all these groupies. It's kind of noted by his enemies and causes them some degree of puzzlement, I think.
But is it not because of that image, I would say, the chilliness and I think that is the draw, isn't it? That women think I could be the one who melts the ice-cold, incorruptible heart, all of that. But actually, we're just talking about women as spectators here, watching men. But we've had one woman in particular. So we talked about Marie Antoinette, but on the side of the revolutionaries, we've had one woman in particular that we've mentioned a few times in the more recent episodes, who actually is an agent. She has genuine political influence, and that is Madame Roland. So tell me about Madame Roland.
So she is the wife of a Girondin minister, and she essentially is the archetype of the woman who runs a revolutionary salon. So the idea of a salon where movers and shakers meet up, discuss philosophy or current politics or whatever. Yeah. Again, it's something that is inherited from the Ancien Régime. But Madame Roland sets up the kind of the classic revolutionary salon. But she's not just a hostess. I mean, as you said, she is an actor. She, in a way, is much more forceful, much more dynamic, much more proactive than her husband. So she is the person who comes up with the idea of recruiting the fédérés from across France. These are the people who will come singing the Marseillaise from the south of France, for instance. So that's her idea. And in the early months of 1792, as the royal constitution is starting to implode, she is writing letters left, right and centre. So she's writing letters to Brissot and his colleagues, accusing them of being time wasters, of supporting the king when his regime is clearly on its uppers. She pushes her husband to support the suspension of the king. He'd been kind of hesitant about this. So she's very forceful. She has very strong opinions. And she is able, because of her position in the salon, because she has all these amazing connections, to let her opinions be known. Yeah. They have an impact. But again, there's this, she does not herself think that women should play a role in kind of public politics. So she doesn't invite other women to her salon. It's hers and hers alone.
That's very Margaret Thatcher, isn't it? It's how Margaret Thatcher ran her government.
So Madame Roland, I don't think Mrs. Thatcher would go this far, but she says women must inspire political endeavour, yet without seeming to be contributing to it.
Right.
And you mentioned Marie Antoinette. I think it's really striking. Madame Roland is very, very hostile to Marie Antoinette. And one of the reasons for this is that she condemns Marie Antoinette for being a malign influence on the king and therefore on politics generally. And so she condemns what she calls the faint rustling of silk behind the royal curtain. The idea that when Louis XVI is being attended by his ministers, Marie Antoinette is there kind of whispering from behind screens. And of course, the irony of that is that these are precisely the terms in which many of her enemies, so Robespierre, Danton, the Montagnards, the people who are opposed to the Girondins, and Madame Roland is a Girondin, this is how they condemn her, as someone who is kind of hiding behind a curtain, whispering.
They literally say she is the new Madame de Pompadour. She is the new Madame du Barry. She is the overmighty female favourite who has corrupted and seduced this sort of the slack-minded, gullible men who flock around her. I mean, she fits it basically into a standard demonology, doesn't she?
She does. And it's to cast her husband as the new Louis XVI. Kind of venal, pliable, emasculated.
Yeah.
And over the course of that summer, as tensions between the Girondins and those who are kind of further to the left, you might put it like that, she becomes a kind of hate figure for many of the sans-culottes. She's, I guess, what would she be? Kind of Polly Toynbee, perhaps.
Right, that's the way that which blue-collar Trump voters talked about Hillary Clinton, for example. Nagging. She's only got where she has because of her husband. She's always telling us off and telling us what's good for us.
All of that kind of thing. And I think that it actually, her role and the things that are said about her and the misogyny that is directed at her, ironically kind of, is drawing on the traditions of misogyny that had earlier condemned Marie Antoinette. It helps to polarize the political division between the Montagnards and the Girondins. And it's kind of striking that it is the Montagnards, those who are furthest left, those who are most committed to the ideals of liberty, equality, and of course, fraternity, brotherhood, not sisterhood, who are, I think, the readiest to see female claims to a commanding role in the revolution as actually being counter-revolutionary. And of course, these, on the furthest left, the Robespierre, the Marat, so on, these are the men who most identify with the model of antique virtue, with Spartans, with kind of the Romans of the early Republic.
And we know what the Romans thought about women being involved in politics. They thought it was a terrible thing.
Yes, because they saw the role, and Spartans paradigmatically saw the role of women to be wives and to be mothers. So, in other words, women who are dedicated to the male citizen. Their role is to serve them, to enable them to do their patriotic duty, and then to give them more sons who can continue to serve the Republic. And this is very clearly drawing on kind of Spartan and Roman ideals. And it's an ideal that right from the beginning is there in all the kind of the festivals that are staged, in the rhetoric, all of that kind of thing. And it leaves open the question, which I think we should maybe try and answer after a break. Are there actually any women who are pushing for full political rights? And if there are, what is the response to them?
Well, the good news for people who like The Rest is History is that there are such women, because otherwise there would be no second half. So return after the break and we will meet two of them. See you then. Today's episode is brought to you by 1,000 Blows, the new original series premiering exclusively on Disney+.
1,000 Blows is inspired by the remarkable true life story of the infamous Mary Carr, who led a notorious all-female London gang, the 40 Elephants. And as it's International Women's Day this week, we thought we'd talk about not necessarily the most notorious women in history, but some of the most remarkable ones, didn't we, Dominic?
We did indeed. So I don't know who yours is, Tom, but the person who we've talked about in The Rest is History that I often think about is a young woman called Sophie Scholl, who grew up in Germany in the late 1930s, early 1940s. And she was a young woman of enormous sort of earnestness and kind of moral seriousness. And she and her brother Hans joined and were key parts of an organization called the White Rose Group, which distributed pamphlets and leaflets across Germany attacking the crimes of the Third Reich. And as you'll remember, Tom, Sophie came to a very sad end, that she and Hans were captured and they were interrogated and tried and executed by the Nazis. And the story of her in prison, in the Stadelheim prison, in the last hours before her death, and she's sort of praying, and she's completely unapologetic about standing up against the horrors of Nazism. I think it's one of the most inspirational stories in all history, not just in 20th century history.
Yeah, such a remarkable young woman. I've chosen a young woman who didn't die for liberty, but she was an extraordinary footballer, or soccer player, if you're watching this in America. She was called Lily Parr. She was born in St. Helens in Lancashire in 1905. She was part of a huge family, lots of boys. And she, as a girl, loved playing rugby and particularly football. And when the First World War hit Britain, men's football basically got cancelled. And so everyone started watching women's football instead. And Lily was an incredible player. So when she was 14, she got recruited to play for this munitions factory called Dick Kerr's. And she was only 14, and she scored, I think, something like 100 goals in her first season. And she played right the way through the First World War, into the aftermath of the Second World War. She was famous for the brutality of her kicking. She's said to have broken the leg of one man when she took a free kick. She broke another man's arm, and footballs then were really, really heavy. So for her to kick it, I mean, absolutely amazing. And what made her sporting ability even more remarkable is that she loved smoking, and she was never seen without a woodbine between her teeth, and gradually her teeth all rotted and fell out. And in due course, the men who controlled football in England got resentful of the fame of the female teams, and so they basically banned them from using the professional football grounds. Very sad. But so Lily retired and she became a nurse, but she was never forgotten. And she's now celebrated as one of England's not just greatest sports women, but sports people of all time. And I think that she was the first woman to be inducted into English football's Hall of Fame. So, she's not up there with Sophie Scholl, but she was a remarkable, remarkable woman.
It's brilliant, isn't it, Tom, that women's stories like these are being restored to their proper place in recent history. And that's one reason I'm looking forward to this new series so much. So this segment was brought to you by our friends at Disney+.
So 1,000 Blows, that is a new original series, and it is streaming right now on Disney+ globally. And if you're watching this in the US, it is on Hulu.
This episode is brought to you by Rocket Money.
Tom, we often talk about how to organise our finances. I'm very conscious that I'm paying for a lot of mad subscriptions. And there's one thing that we've talked about often on this show. It's the thing that we probably hate more than any other, and it's a hidden fee. I would love to get my finances under control. There are all these things piling up on our bank statements, and I think I need to fix this problem. I need to sort this out and to stop this.
I mean, my finances are so chaotic that I need this app.
So I'll tell you what it is. It's called Rocket Money. It's a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions. It monitors your spending, and it helps to lower your bills so that you can grow your savings.
With Rocket Money, you can track all of your subscriptions, and you can easily cancel within the app with just a few taps, saving you time, avoiding charges. And you can also set budgets and goals and get personalized insights and regular reports to track how you're doing. They will even send you real-time alerts for large transactions, upcoming bills, refunds, and even low balances. So let Rocket Money help you reach your financial goals faster. Join at rocketmoney.com/ishistory.
That's rocketmoney.com/ishistory. rocketmoney.com/ishistory. Welcome back to The Rest is History. Before the break, Tom promised you, he said he'd got binders full of women who were pushing for full political rights. And actually, one of them is an old friend of the show. So a tremendous character who was very prominent in the Women's March on Versailles cut a very flamboyant figure, and that is Théroigne de Méricourt. So she had kind of pistols in her belt. She looked a bit like a pirate. She had
adamant.
She had a kind of, and a what?
Adamant.
Like adamant, yeah. She looked like a new romantic, exactly.
Yeah.
She had a kind of liberty cap. She had a fancy hat. She's on a horse. Cuts a great figure. But actually, she then gets into a bit of a mess, doesn't she?
Terrible scrape.
Yeah, a scrape. Is that what it is? It's a scrape. So she's captured by Austrian agents. Tell us about that.
Well, because she's actually Belgian. So she's from Liège, which is under kind of Austrian-ruled Low Countries. And May 1790, she goes there very ill-advisedly, to catch up with all her old friends. And she gets arrested by Austrian agents, put into prison. And the Austrians see this as a great coup because she's notorious as a kind of revolutionary Amazon. And so this is a great prize. And they transport her all the way to Austria, where she is kept in prison for months and months. And she's finally released at the end of 1791 because rather sweetly, her jailer has grown very fond of her.
Oh.
She seems to be a very charismatic person. And the jailer had obviously developed a bit of a shine for her. And so she then gets released and goes back to Paris. And of course, her role in the Women's March has now been supplemented by the fact that she's been imprisoned by Austrian despots. You couldn't have a kind of better calling card, really. And so this gives her a stature among revolutionary men as a hero of the revolution that I think no other woman can rival, because she's been there, she's done the hard yards, she's got the notches in her escutcheon to show that she's really served the revolution. And so even before her imprisonment, she'd spoken at the Cordelier Club, which is the most radical of all the clubs. And after it, she is allowed to come and give an account of what she'd been getting up to in the prison and everything at the Jacobin Club itself. So, these are very, very distinctive, almost kind of unprecedented markers of her status. But I think the very taste of what it would be to be a kind of political player, to be not just a spectator at these clubs, but a participant, makes it all the more frustrating for her that women are essentially kept out of that they're not allowed to do it.
Yeah.
And so she pursues a policy of trying to counter that. So she attempts to found women's only clubs, mixed clubs, but it doesn't work. And it largely doesn't work because women don't really seem to have wanted to participate in them. And then in 1792, she gives up on the whole sitting around and talking, because of course she's very much a woman for a pistol in a belt.
Yeah.
And so with Paris being threatened, she agitates for a women's battalion to be set up to help in the defense of Paris. And again, this is turned down. When the attack on the Tuileries happens, the attack that results in the massacre of the Swiss guards, she's there, she's all over it. It's very much her scene, kind of brandishing pistols again. And for this, she receives public honor. But I think that she remains an anomaly because she's taught between the traditional dimensions of the masculine and the feminine, the kind of the active and the domestic, the political and the person who stays at home fostering and looking after the people who will engage in politics, namely men. And in due course, as we will see, because we'll continue her story in subsequent episodes, this tension, it ends up destroying her.
So just before you move on to the other person you want to talk about, there are other people who agree with her, other women who agree with her and say, especially when war is declared, they want to join the war effort. So there are two sisters called the Thronged sisters who took up arms in the defense of Valenciennes in the east of France. The general was so impressed by them, he promised to put them in the line of fire at the first opportunity. And then there's a petition put up by an activist called Pauline Léon, which was read out to the Legislative Assembly. So this is summer 1792. Our fathers, husbands and sons may perhaps be the victims of our enemy's fury. Could we be forbidden the sweetness of avenging them or dying at their sides? You cannot refuse us. Society cannot deny us this right which is given us by nature unless it's claimed that the Declaration of Rights does not apply to women. And the Legislative Assembly, do you know what it does? It just ignores them because people are embarrassed. And actually, in April 1793, the convention bans women, officially bans them from going into battle. But that issue of the Declaration of Rights brings us to the other great character that you're going to talk about today, who is a great favourite of mine, and her name is Olympe de Gouges. So tell us about her.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right that there are women who, listening to the revolutionary rhetoric, the talk about the rights of men, draw the logical conclusion and say, well, if men have rights, why don't women? And as you said, war seems to have been a particular focus for this. The idea that men should defend the country. If men can defend it, why not women? And there are those who want to do that. But equally, the revolutionary authorities regard it as an embarrassment. They don't really want to give any encouragement to it. And that's why nothing really comes of it. There is no revolutionary battalion of Amazons defending la patrie on the barricades. And it's left to one woman in particular to hammer home for what I think clearly from our perspective seems a monstrous unfairness. And as you said, this is Olympe de Gouges, a woman who is becoming, I think, better known pretty much by the year. Would you say?
Yeah, better known now than she's ever been, I would say.
And that is because more than anybody else in the revolution, she is exposing this key hypocrisy. If there are rights of men, then why not rights of women? And she is, I think, a very attractive figure. I mean, literally attractive. She's very charming, described in 1770 as one of Paris's prettiest women. But she's just also, her personality is very appealing. She's kind of witty. She seems fun. I think that's probably the best way to describe it. And she's born in the Languedoc, but she comes to Paris in 1768 when she is 20 years old. And she does so initially as the mistress of a wealthy industrialist from Lyon. There is all kinds of gossip in Paris that she is a courtesan. So there is a paper called La Correspondance, who writes in 1770, so 2 years after her appearance in Paris, that she's born with a pretty face as her only heritage. She is known in Paris for some time solely through the favours with which she gratifies her compatriots. And one of these compatriots, it was rumoured, was Dominic, your old friend, the Duke of Orleans, Philippe Égalité.
Truly terrible man.
With whom she was supposed to have had an affair. Whether she had an affair with him or not, she was definitely part of his circle. And she goes to the Palais Royal, which people may remember is this kind of great complex of buildings in the centre of Paris, owned by the Duke of Orleans, which in the pre-revolutionary world was a kind of place of free thinking. Anything could be published there, anything could be said. And this is the world into which Olympe de Gouges moves, and she becomes a kind of leading contributor to it. She's fascinated by it. She is obsessed by all the ideas and the currents of conversation, the politics there. And what's amazing about this is that her background is actually unbelievably poor. She'd arrived in Paris barely able to read or write. I mean, much debate among scholars as to whether she could read or write at all. And on top of that, French wasn't even her first language. She spoke Occitan.
So she would have liked Marianne.
Yeah, she would. Yeah, exactly. Her background is absolutely full of kind of the melodrama that you get in novels of this period. So the identity of her father is very mysterious. On the birth certificate, it says that she's the daughter of a butcher, but there's much controversy about this. She liked to hint that she was the daughter of a marquis. At times, she might even hint that she was the daughter of the king. So great kind of excitement, a swirl of melodrama there. And she had then been forced into marriage at a very young age to a man she absolutely hated, and who again, in a very melodramatic way, drowned in a flood. And this is what enabled her then to reject any prospect of future marriage. She hated the institution of marriage, condemned it as a form of slavery, and to come to Paris. I mean, clearly as a kept woman, but maybe a courtesan as well. But she is very, very smart. And this woman who, when she arrived in Paris, could barely read or write, she very quickly becomes not just a kind of a participant in intellectual debate, but she becomes, first of all, a novelist and then a playwright. So she writes her first novel in 1784, then gets very into the theatre. She becomes a friend of Sébastien Mercier, who we talked about in the previous episode, that playwright who came up with all the horrific details about the death of the Princesse de Lamballe. And her most famous play is called L'Esclavage des Noirs, The Slavery of the Blacks. is a very ripe melodrama about a young girl being reunited with her long-lost father. So Olympe de Gouges is clearly working issues out there. But it is also very, very vehemently abolitionist. So she is hugely opposed to the slave trade. And the impact of this play is such that the slave trade lobby pay hecklers to go to the theatre and to shout it down. And such is the kind of the uproar that this generates, that the play can only be staged for 3 nights and it has to be withdrawn, which is obviously, on one level, very bad for Olympe de Gouges. She wants the message to get out there. She's going to miss out on the money that she would otherwise have earned. But it does make her famous. It makes her a figure of prestige and status in the intellectual world of pre-revolutionary Paris. And by and large, I think it's fair to say that anyone who is a committed abolitionist before the revolution, when the revolution comes, is pretty much bound to be in favour of it.
Yeah, of course.
And Olympe de Gouges she's a big fan of the revolution.
But with caveats, right?
Yeah, quite a kind of idiosyncratic take on it. So she always has a very soft spot for Louis XVI. And again, it may be this thing, she identifies with Louis XVI as a man who's unfortunate in his parents.
Yeah.
A bit like she was with her father.
Or maybe she's really his daughter after all.
Well, I think she was meant to be the daughter of Louis XV.
Oh, right. So she's his, what does that make her? His, is it?
Stepsister.
Yeah, stepsister. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
half-sister.
nice.
Half-sister. Oh, no, it's too complicated. I can't work it out. But anyway, so she feels that Louis XVI has been dealt a very bad hand by his predecessors, by Louis XV and the people who've gone before. And so she wrote about him, an unhappier king than his ancestors. Is he to be made responsible for their mistakes? So right the way through everything that follows the fall of the Bastille, right the way up to the flight to Varennes when Louis XVI and the royal family try to escape Paris and France. She's very, very, always sticking up for him. When he makes his flight to Varennes, she's very, very disappointed in him.
Yeah, understandably.
She feels that, he's let her down, he's let France down, but worst of all, he's let himself down.
Yeah.
But she still feels sorry for him. And I think that's reflective of the fact that above all, she has a big heart, Dominic.
Oh.
She feels the sufferings of others deeply.
Yeah.
So whether it's the, slaves in the Caribbean, whether it's the poor, whether it's the king, whether it's animals, she's a great animal lover. She feels compassion for them all.
That's lovely. We love somebody with a big heart.
So I think that this explains why she comes to feel as she does about the revolution. Just as the king has let her down, so she feels that the revolution is letting her down. So people may remember, I can't even remember which episode it was now. We've done so many episodes on the revolution. But back in 1791, France gets its first written constitution. Yeah. This is the one that Louis XVI had been trying not to sign, and eventually he kind of feels bulldozed into doing it. And it passes into law on the 3rd of September 1791. Louis XVI accepts it 10 days later. This is now the constitution that is going to govern France.
Yeah.
And this is the one that offers a measure of suffrage to men, but not to women. Mm. And Olympe de Gouges is appalled by this. And she says, well, what about women? Why shouldn't women have the vote? Why shouldn't women have rights as well? And so 12 days later, on the 15th of September, she's written this riposte and she publishes it. And it's called, very pointedly, The Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen. So it's an obvious parody of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And it's a marker of her, again, idiosyncratic take on politics, that she dedicates this to Marie Antoinette.
It's the last person that you would choose, right? It's if you were worried about your standing in revolutionary Paris.
And it's simultaneously a kind of parody of revolutionary idealism, but also I think its ultimate expression, because by echoing the original declaration, she's aiming to remind the world what it's missing. So woman is born free and is equal to man in her rights. And she's deliberately parodying the phrases of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And she is demanding that women share in all these rights, which of course includes suffrage. And she articulates this in a very famous way, and one that looks forward notoriously to what is to happen in 1793, when she writes, "Woman has the right to climb onto the scaffold. She must equally have the right to climb onto the tribunal." So in other words, if she can be executed, then she should have the right to govern the laws, to vote.
Grimly ironic words.
Very grimly ironic. Now, what is the response to this Declaration of the Rights of Women? There are certainly revolutionaries male revolutionaries who accept its force. The most prominent of these is the erstwhile Marquis de Condorcet, who we met again ages ago. He's a philosopher, kind of Enlightenment philosophe, very, very anti-Christian. He's an economist. He's very agitated by polluted rivers. And like Olympe de Gouges, he's a very committed abolitionist. So all reasons why he would be sympathetic to what she's arguing. And he absolutely supports female suffrage. And I think it's not just Olympe de Gouges who is kind of influencing him on this. It's also his own wife, who is a very, very impressive woman called Sophie de Grouchy, who is sister of a guy who will in due course become one of Napoleon's most celebrated marshals, Emmanuel de Grouchy. Now, we've had quite a lot of relationships in this series, and indeed in the rest of history generally, where the man is quite a lot older than the woman. So the age gap between Condorcet and Sophie is 20. So she marries him when he's 22 and he's 42, but it's a very happy match. They're both philosophers, so you can imagine, they have a lovely time sitting around discussing Diderot or Rousseau or whatever. And she's also a very skilled linguist. And Dominic, the tremendous news is that her best second language is English.
Oh, good for her. Yes, she translated Adam Smith.
Yeah.
Tremendous.
And Thomas Paine.
And she actually runs her salon. Unlike Madame Roland, she allows other women to come to her salon.
Including Olympe de Gouges. So that's where they would all have met.
Right, yeah.
And the Condorcet, they're not kind of card-carrying Girondins, but they're definitely aligned with them. And I think it's true to say that the Girondins are much more in favour of female participation in public life than the Montagnards. So even though Madame Roland, she's a Girondin, she's not. It is a kind of part of intellectual discussion among Girondin salon that perhaps women, and particularly at Condorcet's salon, that perhaps there should be female suffrage. And so it's not surprising that Olympe de Gouges she thinks the Girondins are great. She calls them torches of liberty, thronged de Méricourt. She also aligns herself with the Girondins. But in general, it has to be said that the reaction to the Declaration of the Rights of Women, when people can be bothered so much as to respond to it, is either hilarity or just utter contempt.
And isn't it interesting that the more hardcore Jacobins, the Montagnards as they're called, Robespierre and his circle, people like that, they're often among the most contemptuous and the most scornful. And you would think, in other respects, I mean, it's a really good example, I guess, of what some listeners may say is the kind of the patriarchal attitudes, the misogyny, that in other respects they are so democratic. But on this issue, they say, women, are you joking? I mean, ha, 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 women voting. Wouldn't that be a thing?
Yeah. And these are the people who, of course, they're all in favour of sans-culotte wearing the Liberty cap, the bonnet rouge, and indeed of the female representative of the Republic, Liberty, the future Marianne, wearing the Liberty cap, but not actual women. They try and legislate to stop women from wearing it. And their justification for this, it's not just the Spartans, it's not just the Romans. There are also more recent influences, of whom the main ones are the philosophes, so Diderot, but particularly Rousseau.
Yeah.
I mean, Rousseau has an incredible vein of hostility to any notion of female emancipation, of female suffrage. He wrote in his novel, which was a massive bestseller, La Nouvelle Héloïse, a brilliant wife is a plague to her husband, her children, her friends, her valet, everyone. And Rousseau is such a massive influence on the way that particularly young male revolutionaries think, that he kind of provides them with a sanction for kind of celebrating a very overtly masculine ideal of virtue. And of course, as we've said earlier, these are all people who are saturated in Roman literature. So they know that the word virtue itself derives from the Latin for man, vir. Virtus is to have masculine qualities. And when these young revolutionaries are playing the Roman, we talked about this in an earlier episode, to play the Roman often requires a counterpointing of a kind of masculine virtue against a female inadequacy. So David, the great painter, in 1789, he does a painting of Brutus, the man who expelled the king, the kind of the founder of the Roman Republic. And in this painting, the man is shown stern, unyielding, flinty in the cause of liberty. And meanwhile, in the background, you have women having the vapors. They're kind of in hysterics, kind of screaming and generally losing the plot. And it is the role of the man to put the patrie first, then the family. It is the role of the woman to stay within the domestic household and to raise citizens who can then go out and play their part serving the patrie.
I mean, you could translate patrie, right, as homeland or as fatherland, couldn't you?
You absolutely could. Yeah. And so it's for men, radicals, even those on, or maybe especially those on the furthest left, it's this combination, this fusion of the ancient and the cutting edge that serves to justify them in their, well, yeah, their contempt for everything that Olympe de Gouges is arguing for. But I think the thing that's unsettling, perhaps, for us today, and certainly, for many of the feminist scholars that I read on this, is that it's not just men who are thinking this. A majority of women seem to have thought so too. And Condorcet, who's in favour of female suffrage, he's really puzzled by it. And he's one of the people who watches women idolising Robespierre, who's absolutely against female suffrage. And he's kind of really puzzled by it. And so he writes, one wonders sometimes why there are so many women following Robespierre at his home, at the podium of the Jacobins, at the Cordeliers, at the convention. And he says, which is absolutely right, well, maybe one reason for this is that women are reading Rousseau too. And La Nouvelle Héloïse, his great novel, I mean, that's a massive with women. So maybe they're imbibing it. So Madame Rollin is a big fan of Rousseau. Rosalie Julien, who you were quoting in the previous episode.
Yeah.
I mean, she was a big fan of Rousseau. So, I mean, maybe it's that. But I can't really believe that that's...
It's not just that, though, is it? So if you think 100 years hence, when there are going to be huge arguments about women voting, often among the most vociferous opponents of it are other women, opposing suffrage campaigns, not just in France, in Britain, in the United States, wherever. And don't historians think that effectively a lot of women had internalized the assumptions of the age, that they have come to believe what they're told, that they have their domestic sphere, which is their domain, and that there is the public sphere, which is the domain of men?
I think it's this language of rights, perhaps, that underpins it, which Olympe de Gouges is drawing on, but it also applies to men. So one of the striking things about this election to the convention, which is it's the first really full male suffrage in any election. I think our perspective today would be people denied a right to vote would embrace it. They would feel that a great weight had been lifted off their shoulders, that a great injustice had been righted.
Yeah.
But what's striking about that election is how few people participate in it.
10%.
I think it's something like 1 in 6.
Yeah, terrible.
Yeah, maybe 1 in 10. That must reflect maybe a bewilderment, a puzzlement, simply an inability to understand what's being offered on the part of men who are being given this right. And presumably then the same would be true of women, that this is such a kind of novel way of understanding politics and the role of individuals within a polity, that people just can't get a handle on it. And maybe it's a bit like about slavery, where similar debates are happening. And it's kind of striking that Olympe de Gouges is an abolitionist as well as an enthusiast for female suffrage, that she's arguing for things that today we take so for granted that we can't even understand how people could possibly have thought otherwise.
Yeah.
And yet the fact that she is so scorned and despised and mocked does, I think, remind us of just how revolutionary principles that today we completely accept once were. And I think there's a case for saying that, for all her soft spot for Louis XVI, for all the fact that she dedicates the Declaration of the Rights of Women to Marie Antoinette, there is a case for saying that Olympe de Gouges is as radical, if not more radical, than any of the revolutionaries that we've talked about in this series.
Tom, I could not agree with you more. I think actually, by far, she's the most radical. So all that the men are arguing for, the Robespierres, the Marats, whatever, it's within the bounds of the imagination. There have been republics, right? I mean, England executed its king. There has been the Dutch Republic. There's the Roman Republic. It is perfectly plausible to imagine that, even though you might think it's a bad thing, which a lot of people in France obviously did, but, you can imagine it. It's not making your head hurt to think about it. But I think with this, what's clearly the case when she presents that Declaration of the Rights of Women, when she unveils it, the ridicule, the contempt, the disbelief that greets it is a sign that a lot of people just simply cannot imagine a world in which women exercise political power.
Including women.
Yeah, including women themselves, exactly. That they are, as it were, I don't want to say prisoners of the same imagination, because that casts people in the past as somehow lesser than us. We're more enlightened, and I don't generally like that kind of language, but I think it is fair to say that just as we are trapped by our own preconceptions in ways that we don't even recognize, they are absolutely trapped by theirs.
But I think it also suggests that we are beneficiaries of the events that we're describing in this series in ways that we may not appreciate, that we may mistake for truths so self-evident that they don't need to be argued for, that's not what they are at all, that they are in fact kind of radical, intellectual, ideological innovations that ultimately succeed because we come to feel, they're absolutely right. When they are first proposed, just seem absolutely kind of mad.
Well, Tom, there are a lot of people in the world right now, when we're recording this, who would listen to this episode and would say they are mad. I mean, there are people right now, in the people who are currently administering Afghanistan or indeed Iran, who would say, a lot of what Olympe de Gouges was arguing was bonkers. So maybe we shouldn't be entirely complacent about it, I guess.
Yes, well, it's yes. But it's nice to hear you finally say something good about the revolution. So Theo will be pleased about that.
Well, I'm not saying something good about the revolution. I'm saying about Olympe de Gouges, because as we will discover in a future episode...
Yes. Revolution doesn't treat her well, does it?
No, it does not treat her well, which is yet another black mark, I'm afraid. So, jolly good, Tom. That was absolutely fascinating. And kind of overdue. We should have... we've done a lot about men in the revolution.
We've done quite a lot about women as well.
Well, we have. We did start with a woman, I guess. So next week, we will be getting back to the narrative, won't we? Because I think we left it last time with the Prussians.
Cliffhanger.
They were approaching Paris. They're 120 miles away, and they've just turned to finish off the last French army at Valmy. And listeners will be excited to hear that there is going to be a thrilling twist to the story. We love a thrilling twist on the rest of history.
Can't wait.
So, Tom, what could people do if they wanted to hear that episode now, literally now?
They could sign up to the Rest is History Club. And not only will they be able to hear both the 2 episodes yet to come, but they will get a slew, Dominic, a slew of additional benefits.
And just to be very clear, we are a mixed club. And Tom, do we treat our male and female members equally?
Yeah, we're all about égalité.
We treat them equally badly. And on that bombshell, we will see you next time for the most exciting twist in European history. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.